A lot of these traditions, the dressing up, the trick-or-treating, even the jack-o'-lanterns, seem to have Catholic origins to them instead of pagan. We talked about the sort of pseudo-history that these are all pagan things. They actually do have Christian origins. So I don't think there's anything per se wrong with dressing up and doing trick-or-treating and all that, but I would caution of what you want to expose your children to.
The dark charm of Halloween. What is so attracting about Halloween and it's more dark pagan-like culture bits that we embrace as Catholics? And what's the true history of All Hallows Eve? Where's the tradition of Catholic faith versus modern culture? Where is that divide? We're going to be having that conversation today on the program. Father William Rock from the Fraternity of St. Peter's going to be on with us at 30 past the hour to talk about the tradition of All Hallows Eve, how to hold the Catholic feast in a way that is different from society around you, right? In a good way, praise be to God.
By the way, my name is Joe McLean. I host a radio program called A Catholic Take, where we look at the world through a Catholic lens. I'd love for you to hang out with us. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below.
We have forgotten what our Catholic traditions are, and so I've invited Father William Rock from St. Stanislaus in Nashua to join us today to help remind us of the tradition of Holy Mother Church in this time of year. So let's talk about All Hallows Eve versus Halloween. What is the history and tradition of this, of what people commonly refer to as Halloween? Where did it all come from?
Right, very good. Well, as you kind of just hinted there, Halloween is short for Hallows Eve, which is itself sort of short for All Hallows Eve. And the Eve is the day before. So the day before Christmas is Christmas Eve, and the day before the Feast of All Hallows is All Hallows Eve, although we might know it more today as the Feast of All Saints. So All Hallows is the Feast of All Saints, and the day before is the Eve, so we'd call it All Hallows Eve. Now, if you were to look into the liturgical books, the historical liturgical books, you don't find the phrases Christmas Eve and All Hallows Eve. What you would find is Vigil. So if you look at the day before Christmas, it's the vigil day of the Nativity of our Lord, and translated from the Latin. And if you were to look at the books for the day before All Saints Day, it would say the vigil of all saints. But we have to understand here that historically and traditionally, vigil meant a day of preparation immediately preceding a feast, usually penitential in nature. And the purpose was to prepare for the feast the next day. Sort of in normal parlance, unfortunately, today, vigil has come to mean sort of a mass the night before that fulfills the obligation for the next day. But technically, that would be an anticipated mass. The vigil day is this day of penitential preparation. It would be violet in color, have its own particular divine office and mass of the day. And that mass of the day is the vigil mass. So when we're talking about All Hallows Eve, the vigil of all saints, we're talking about this day of penitential preparation for the feast day that would come the day after. And historically, the day of, or the vigil of all saints, even codified in the 1917 code, would have been a day of fasting and abstinence. So historically, the Catholic way, main way of celebrating the feast of Halloween would actually be to keep it as a day of fasting and abstinence. So it does seem that in certain parts of the world, of the Catholic world at the time, this day also took on certain other features, particularly ones of almsgiving and of charity, of good works, particularly of giving out food to beggars. And what sort of developed, which developed around other times of the year, also around Christmas, there was this relaxing of the social norms, where you would have these groups going around called mummers or guisers, guising or mumming as they would call it, dressed up or just sort of hiding their identity, pretending to be beggars. And there was a sort of understanding that if you went to a house dressed up this way, or you were an actual beggar, no matter what, you'd be allowed into the house and given some food as an alms. And so this kind of developed into what we would call today trick-or-treating, where they would go there, they kind of be hiding their identity as a way of relaxing the social norms. Everyone kind of knew everybody, but they were just kind of going along with it for the sake of the day, for the relaxation of the norms. And they would enter in, they would ask for, an alms in terms of an apple or whatever food might be available, and promise a little bit of mischief if it wasn't granted. And it would just sort of be a good time for everyone. So you would have this kind of union between sort of this lightheartedness of keeping the day, but also it grew out originally as an act of charity towards the needy.
Why does the occult gravitate to this day?
I would say it's a result of bad scholarship is actually what it comes down to. So we do know that there is this pagan, Celtic pagan day associated with the 31st to the 1st here at the end of the month into the next month. However, if we look at actual historical documentation, it looks like it was what was called a quarter day. So it's just indicating the transition between seasons. And if we look at sort of more contemporary accounts of what went on that day, was more of like a fair. It's a harvest festival. There would be food, drink. It didn't really have much of a religious pagan aspect or spiritual aspect to it. It wasn't until we get to the 1600s, particularly a work by Geoffrey Keating in his History of Ireland, that we start getting these sort of druid satanic associations with this feast that we call Halloween today. And unfortunately, it was known at the time that his scholarship was bad, that what he was presenting was bad scholarship, that it wasn't really based in historical reality, but it just kind of took off. And it's sort of been with us since the 1600s because of first sort of a Protestant polemic, so very sort of anti-Catholic polemics. They were able to use this as a bludgeon against the Catholic Church to be like, see, you just took this sort of pagan feast day and kind of dressed it up as Christian, but it's really this like witchcrafty pagan druid thing. And then it was then picked up by just sort of anti-Christian, anti-theistic ideas or forces in general. And so you get it repeated sort of like in this article. And it just gets repeated and repeated and repeated, but no one actually like does the work to check if it's historically accurate. And the truth is it's not. So even though, and so what might have been like when you talk about the witches, the high holy day for sort of the neo-pagans or whatever, it's really not historically founded. If you look back to what was going on in Ireland at the time that they sort of say this was going on again, which is a harvest festival, relatively harmless. It didn't have all these weird associations with sacrifice and the occult and everything. Again, that's a result of bad scholarship starting in the 1600s that we just have not been able to put behind us. I think it's good to point out, too, that sort of the general history you get of this, that there was this pagan feast with all this bad stuff, and then they converted, but they couldn't really give it up, so the church just kind of Christianized it. The problem with that is that, again, because it's a vigil day, you have to look at the origin of the actual feast day, the first for All Saints. But the problem is that date of the first started in continental Europe. If we look at the actual Christian Irish liturgical books, their Feast of All Saints would have been in the spring on April 20th, I believe. And so it wasn't until they adapted the sort of continental date that it corresponded with this Irish quarter day. So it just ended up kind of being almost coincidental that it ended up corresponding, but it wasn't intentional. Because when it was originally the Feast of All Saints, and then it seems that the Feast of All Saints and its vigil instituted at the same time. Every liturgical book we have that talks about the Feast of All Saints has the vigil the day before, but it was instituted in continental Europe on the 31st and the 1st, but in Ireland it was the 19th and 20th of April, and it wasn't until they adopted the continental date. And so the date of All Saints and All Hallows Eve was formed independently of this pagan quarter day, and it just ended up sort of landing on the pagan quarter day when Ireland again adopted the continental date. So I think it's very important to keep in mind historically that it wasn't this Christianization of this pagan thing. It just kind of happened as I sort of laid out there. So
now, my wife likes to put skulls out at this time of year. She puts one skull out on our family altar, memento mori. Remember that we're going to die someday, and to prepare well for that. So what's the difference between the Catholic understanding of memento mori and society's understanding of skulls and skeletons? I mean, the trend now is to put this 10-foot skeleton on your lawn. I don't know why, but everybody's doing it these days. It's all the rage. Are there any differences between those two things?
Yes, I would say that there definitely is, because as you were saying, there is this historical Catholic practice of putting out things like skulls, maybe skeletons, hourglasses with wings, other symbols of death, especially at this time of year with a month that's dedicated to the faithful departed, to remind us of our own mortality, that we're all going to die, we're all going to face judgment after death, and that time is fleeting. We don't know when our death will come, and our time here is short. And you'll see in different religious houses where they'll have the skull either in the cells or in the refectory as this constant reminder to the religious there that they're preparing for their death. But I think that's completely different from sort of the secular take that is going on with it, where it's more of this almost obsession or glorification of sort of the dark and the ghoulish and the things that go bump in the night, which isn't sort of the Catholic take on things, where it really should be this idea of you're going to die and you're going to be judged, so start living your life accordingly, as opposed to just sort of this glorification of whatever it is they're trying to get across.
What would you say to parents that want to keep the feast in the traditional way, but also, should they be engaging in anything from a more secular perspective? Should they go trick-or-treating? Should they go to a haunted house? Should they watch horror movies? What do you say?
I think it's a complicated question, and a lot of it's going to depend on sort of what you're comfortable with, but hopefully I can give some general guidelines. So first, as I said, sort of in our last segment, that even up into the 1917 Code of Canon Law, it would have been a day of fasting and abstinence. The 31st would be a day of fasting and abstinence. And this was the universal observation until 1955 under Pius XII, when the observance changed. And as I said, the 31st would have had its own office, its own mass of the day, and it would have been a day of fasting and abstinence. And so I think to rediscover it, I would say maybe backing up a step, I think part of the problem why we have, from the Catholic point of view, a problem with this day is that we've lost the liturgical anchoring that used to anchor the Catholic practice of this day. It was taken away from the general observance in the 1950s, 1955. And so we're kind of just left with the secular aspect. But I think part of the Catholic recovery is to recover as much as we can sort of the liturgical observation. So I'd start by saying treat it as a day of preparation for the next day, which is what historically would have been that vigil day, a day of preparation for the feast day, the next day, All Saints. And the way that would have been done historically, again, fasting and abstinence. So you can have like one meal, 2 little meals, and avoid meat if you can. Now, for those who are listening, this is not obligatory. If you don't do it, you're not committing any sin. This is sort of recommendations on how to keep it in the way that our forefathers would have. I would say if you're able to get to Mass that day, to do that, especially if you're at a parish that uses the 62 Missal, maybe ask the priest ahead of time if he can do a votive Mass for the forgiveness of sins. This way it's kind of in that same penitential theme, that he is wearing the penitential violet as would have been customary on that day. And I think that would be a good way to do it. And then, again, as we talked about last segment, a lot of these traditions, the dressing up, the trick-or-treating, even the jack-o'-lanterns, seem to have Catholic origins to them instead of pagan. It's generally, again, we talked about the sort of pseudo-history that these are all pagan things, but as we sort of discussed, they actually do have Christian origins. So I don't think there's anything per se wrong with dressing up and doing trick-or-treating and all that, but I would caution of what do you want to expose your children to, because some of the outfits, some of the costumes, they're not going to be modest, they're not going to be they might be glorifying the ghoulish, the occult. And, maybe that's not what we want to be exposing our children to. And like you said, maybe there can be a trunk or treating, maybe at the parish. Maybe you can get together with some like-minded Catholic families and just go to those houses, or even just have a house party where everyone gets together in their costumes and you can have games like, bobbing for apples, because the apples, nuts, things like that would have been the sort of staple foods. There's also this practice of making soul cakes, which you would go around, and part of it was you go house to house, sing the little soul cake song, they give you the soul cake, and then you're supposed to pray for the departed of that family. So that's something that could be looked up, making soul cakes for the day and sharing those. And I think it would be good to decorate. So like you mentioned, we could have the memento moris out, as long as we're seeing them as memento moris and not, again, sort of that glorification of the occult or the dark. But then also, if we look at the colors of Halloween, there's violet, which would be the color of the Vigil of All Saints, white and gold, the color of All Saints, black, the color of All Souls. then if you sort of throw in the autumn orange, then you get the colors of Halloween, and we can see them just sort of being, that the color of the season, the color of this Triduum, the All Hallows Tide, the Vigil, All Saints, and All Souls, as a way of expressing that. So I think those would all be good ways of doing it. I think that would be my advice. I think we also need to be aware that there is this vice of curiosity, where we're looking into things that maybe we really shouldn't be looking into. And we see that a lot with like exorcisms and things like that, of people just being overly curious about exorcisms and the demonic, and they really don't need to be looking into it. So, I mean, it is one thing where if you're a priest, where you need to have certain training, have certain knowledge, but in terms of the general sort of Catholic population, yes, be aware that these dark forces exist, the demons do exist, but just attach yourself to the normal means that the church uses, the sacramentals, holy water, the St. Benedict medal. We don't need to go to special extremes, especially when the exorcists say that one good confession is worth more than like 100 exorcisms. Just use the normal sacramental life of the church. But I do think that there is this, this vice of curiosity of looking into these things that seem kind of on the fringe, that seem kind of like weird and exciting, and we want to kind of get into that. But really, we just need to stick to sort of the meat and potatoes of the faith and only really worry about these things if they actually become an issue. And I think Fulton Sheen had that quote, when the church picks down the rosary beads, then the secular culture will pick it up and I guess can, pervert it. And we kind of see the same thing happening here with Halloween, where we had these, Catholic rooted practices back from old Christendom that we've lost the Catholic aspect of them, and they've been picked up and perverted by the secular culture. And so I think the answer to it is not to eschew it altogether or to try to reinvent it somehow, but to go back to our Catholic roots and be like, no, this is ours, and we're reclaiming it as it should be. And I think that's the approach that we should have.
Did you like that video? It's okay. You can admit it. It's perfectly fine. Hey, we cover the big stories of our day, from inside the church to outside the church to all points in between, and we do it from a Catholic perspective. It's called A Catholic Take. It's a radio program Monday through Friday. We live stream it right here on this channel, by the way, so make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We would be very grateful to you. And don't forget, you're going to want to watch this video right here because you don't want to miss anything.